The most powerful person in the room is usually the one who says the least. Picture a conference table on the 32nd floor of a midtown Manhattan office building. 7 people are seated around it, laptops open, coffee going cold. A man at the head of the table has been talking for 11 straight minutes. He has answered every question before anyone finished asking it. He has cited numbers, precedents, 3 case studies, and a personal anecdote about a deal he closed in 2019. He believes, with total conviction, that he is winning this meeting. He is not. 2 seats down, a woman hasn't said more than 40 words. When she does speak, it's not to answer. It's to ask one short question, something like, "What happens if the client says no to that first?" The room goes quiet. Not because the question is aggressive, because nobody had thought of it. The man at the head of the table pauses, recalculates, and for the first time in 11 minutes, he's the one waiting for someone else to speak. That's the whole game. That's the thing almost nobody tells you about influence, and it's the reason this video exists. We've been trained since grade school to believe that having the answer is the entire point. Raise your hand fastest. Know the most facts. Speak with certainty. Somewhere along the way, that training calcified into a belief most successful-looking people carry without ever examining it, that competence is proven by output, that the smart person is the one who fills the silence. But watch closely. In any room that actually matters, a boardroom, a negotiation, a first date, a job interview, a family dinner where something delicate needs to be said, and you'll notice something uncomfortable. The people who seem to hold the most power in that room are very rarely the ones doing the most talking. They're the ones asking the questions that make everyone else do the talking instead. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you walked out of a conversation genuinely impressed by someone, and could you actually remember what they told you, or do you remember what they asked you? Chances are, you remember the question. You remember the moment they looked at you and said something like, "What's the real reason you're considering leaving?" Or, "What would need to be true for this to actually work?" You remember it because it did something rare. It made you feel seen, and it made you think harder than you'd thought in weeks. That person didn't need to prove anything. They let you prove it to yourself, in front of them, which is a far more persuasive thing to witness. Here's the uncomfortable part. If you're like most driven, capable people, people who read career books, who negotiate their own salaries, who have a 5-year plan taped somewhere near their desk, you have almost certainly been optimizing for the wrong skill your entire adult life. You've been building your answers, sharpening your pitch, rehearsing your response to "tell me about yourself," until it comes out smooth and rehearsed and, frankly, forgettable. Meanwhile, the people quietly outperforming you in negotiations, in interviews, in every room where status gets decided in real time, have been building something else entirely. A different muscle. A habit so simple it sounds almost too small to matter, and so rare that almost nobody actually practices it on purpose. The question habit. Not curiosity as a personality trait. Plenty of curious people never get anywhere because their curiosity is scattered, undisciplined, aimed at trivia instead of leverage. This is something more deliberate. It's a practiced, repeatable way of entering any room, a meeting, an interview, a negotiation, a first conversation with someone who could change your career. And instead of leading with what you know, leading with a question precise enough to make everyone else in that room realize you already understand more than you're letting on. Think about that job candidate for a second. The one who didn't just answer, "Why do you want this role?" but instead asked the hiring manager halfway through, "What's the biggest thing that's gone wrong with the last 3 people who sat in this seat?" That's not curiosity. That's strategy wearing curiosity's clothes. And it works over and over in rooms most people never learn to read correctly. You already know this. You felt it before. You've been in a conversation with someone, a mentor, an old boss, maybe a stranger at a dinner party, who asked you one question that rearranged how you saw your own situation. You walked away thinking about them for days, even though they'd told you almost nothing about themselves. Here's what nobody explains clearly enough: that ability isn't charisma. It isn't an accident of personality. It's a specific, learnable habit, a way of thinking before you speak, a discipline about what you choose to hold back. And it can be built by almost anyone willing to unlearn the instinct to answer first. Most people go their entire career without ever being told this directly, because on the surface it looks backwards. Every incentive in modern professional life seems to reward the answer giver. The expert, the one with the deck, the data, the confident close. So why would deliberately asking more and answering less put you ahead of all of them? That question, the real mechanics of why this works and why almost everyone gets it backwards, is where we're headed next. But first, you need to understand exactly what's happening inside your own brain every single time you feel that itch to jump in with an answer, because that itch is older and more automatic than you think. That itch has a name, and it's older than your job, older than your ambitions, older than the conference table itself. It's the same reflex that made you blurt out an answer in 3rd grade before you'd even finished reading the question, chasing the small hit of approval that came from being first, being right, being seen as the one who knew. Nobody had to teach you that reflex. It came pre-installed. Human beings are wired to treat silence as a threat and answers as safety. A gap in conversation feels to your nervous system uncomfortably close to a gap in belonging, and belonging, to a brain built over hundreds of thousands of years in small tribal groups, used to be the difference between survival and expulsion. Say something useful, prove your value, and the tribe keeps you. Go quiet, and someone might start to wonder why you're even there. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual machinery running under the surface every time you feel yourself rushing to fill a silence with an answer, a fact, an opinion nobody asked for. It's not weakness. It's not lack of discipline. It's biology doing exactly what it evolved to do, except it's doing it in a world that no longer rewards the behavior it's protecting you with. Picture a mid-level manager. We'll call the type the closer, because you've met him. He's good at his job. He got there by being fast, by being the guy with the answer in every meeting, the one who could rattle off the Q3 numbers from memory, who never let a question hang in the air for more than 2 seconds before filling it. For years, that instinct served him. It got him noticed. It got him promoted past people who were, on paper, just as capable. Then he hits a ceiling. He's up for a director role, and it goes to someone else, someone quieter, someone who, in the promotion committee meeting, is remembered less for what she said and more for the questions she asked in cross-functional meetings that made other departments feel like she actually understood their problems. The closer is baffled. He worked harder. He knew more. He had, by every measure he'd been taught to value, the better answers. What he didn't have was the thing she'd built without anyone officially teaching it to her, the discipline to sit inside a silence long enough to let someone else reveal what they actually needed, instead of what he assumed they needed based on his own fast, confident read of the situation. Here's the trap, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The faster and more confidently you answer, the more you signal, often without meaning to, that you'd already decided the answer before the other person finished talking, which means on some level you weren't fully listening, you were waiting for your turn. And people can feel that. They can feel the difference between someone who's actually processing what they just said and someone who's just been patient enough to let them finish before delivering a preloaded response. Ask yourself this: how many times have you been in the middle of explaining something important, something you were still working out loud, only to have someone jump in with the solution before you'd even gotten to the part that mattered? How did that feel? Efficient, maybe, but also a little bit like being cut off, a little bit like your process didn't matter, only their conclusion. Now flip it. Think about someone who let you finish, who paused, who asked, "Can you say more about that?" instead of immediately telling you what they thought you should do. That pause did something. It signaled patience, which reads as confidence, which reads, whether anyone consciously names it or not, as status. The person who doesn't need to rush is the person who isn't afraid of the silence. And the person who isn't afraid of silence is, almost always, read by everyone else in the room as the one with the most control. This is the part that trips people up, because it sounds passive, it sounds like doing less. But the discipline of holding a question instead of firing off an answer is, if anything, more demanding than the alternative. It requires you to actually process what's being said instead of running your own internal script. It requires tolerating a few seconds of discomfort, the itch, the tribal alarm bell, without acting on it. It requires trusting that your value in that room isn't proven by how fast you respond, but by how precisely you eventually do. Go back to the closer for a second, because his story doesn't end at that missed promotion. It's actually where it gets interesting. 6 months after losing that role, he sat in on a negotiation with a vendor who was trying to push through a price increase mid-contract. His old instinct would have been to counter immediately, pull out competitor pricing, make his case, close hard and fast, the way he always had. Instead, for reasons he later admitted he didn't fully understand at the time, he just asked, "What changed on your end that's making this necessary now?" The vendor's answer told him everything. Rising material costs on one specific component, not the whole product line, meaning there was a narrower, cheaper path to a compromise than the vendor had led with. He never would have found that path by answering first. He found it by asking and then doing the harder thing, staying quiet long enough to actually hear what came back. That negotiation is where this story is headed next. But it's also where a much bigger pattern starts to reveal itself. One about the specific kind of question that does this work, and why most people, even when they try to ask more questions, end up asking the wrong ones entirely. Not all questions are created equal, and that's the part almost every well-meaning career article gets wrong. Ask more questions has become one of those pieces of advice that sounds true and does almost nothing because it's incomplete. Most people who try it end up asking the same kind of question over and over, safe, generic, easily deflected. What do you think? Any thoughts on that? Does that make sense? These aren't bad questions exactly. They're just weightless. They don't reveal anything. They don't make the other person stop and actually think. They're conversational filler dressed up as curiosity. And everyone in the room can feel the difference between a real question and a placeholder. To understand what separates the two, it helps to walk through a scene that plays out, in some form, in thousands of interview rooms across the country every single week. Picture a candidate, mid-30s, 6 years at a mid-sized logistics company, applying for an operations director role at a growing e-commerce firm outside Columbus, Ohio. She's up against 4 other candidates, all with comparable resumes, comparable years of experience, comparable competence on paper. The hiring manager has sat through 3 interviews already that week and has heard, almost verbatim, the same answers to the same questions 3 separate times. Tell me about a time you solved a supply chain problem. Walk me through your leadership philosophy. Everyone's ready for these. Everyone's rehearsed a version of the answer that makes them sound thoughtful and battle-tested. She answers those questions fine. Not spectacularly, just fine, the way a well-prepared person answers a question they knew was coming. But about 20 minutes in, something shifts. Instead of waiting for the next question, she asks one of her own. What's the biggest thing that's gone wrong with the last 3 people who sat in this seat? The hiring manager pauses, actually pauses, the kind of pause that happens when someone has to genuinely search for an answer instead of retrieving a preloaded one. And what comes out isn't polished, it's real. He mentions that the last director burned out chasing efficiency metrics and lost the trust of the warehouse floor staff, that the one before that was great operationally, but couldn't handle the politics of reporting to two VPs who didn't always agree. That answer is worth more to her in that moment than anything she could have said about her own qualifications, because now she knows exactly what this company is actually afraid of. Not, can you run operations? They already believe she can. That's why she's sitting there. What they're afraid of is repeating a specific painful failure pattern, and she now has the rest of the interview to speak directly to that fear, instead of reciting a generic leadership philosophy that could apply to any job at any company in America. Here's what makes that question so effective, and it's worth breaking down precisely, because this is the mechanism the rest of this video is going to keep returning to. It wasn't just a question. It was a question aimed at a vulnerability the other person hadn't planned on discussing. It required real thought to answer, which meant it couldn't be deflected with a rehearsed line. And, critically, this is the part people miss, it revealed to the hiring manager that she'd already done the work of thinking about failure modes in that role before he'd told her anything about them. The question itself was evidence of competence. She didn't need to say, I understand the risks of this position. She demonstrated it by asking about them with precision. That's the difference between a real question and a filler question. A filler question asks the other person to perform for you. A real question asks the other person to reveal something they weren't planning to reveal, and in doing so, it does double duty. It gathers genuine intelligence you can use, and it signals wordlessly that you're operating at a level above the surface-level exchange everyone else in that room has been having all week. Ask yourself this: the next time you're heading into a meeting, an interview, a negotiation, what's the question you're actually planning to ask? If it's something the other person could answer on autopilot, in their sleep, having answered it 100 times before to 100 other people, it's not going to do any work for you. It's just noise with a question mark at the end. The hiring manager, by the way, didn't consciously register any of this in the moment. He didn't think this candidate has just demonstrated superior strategic thinking through incisive interrogative technique. He just felt something shift. He felt more engaged, more honest, more like he was talking to a peer than interviewing a subordinate. That feeling is the entire ball game. Most decisions about who gets the job, who gets the deal, who gets trusted with the next big project, they don't get made on a spreadsheet of qualifications. They get made on a feeling of this person gets it, and that feeling is manufactured, more often than people realize, by the quality of what someone asks, rather than the polish of what they answer. She got the job, incidentally, not because her resume was stronger than the other 4 candidates. It wasn't, not meaningfully. She got it because for 4 minutes in a 40-minute interview, she made the hiring manager feel like he was finally being understood instead of pitched to. And that's a feeling most people in most rooms are quietly starving for without ever naming it out loud. But there's a harder, more uncomfortable version of this same dynamic, one that doesn't show up in interviews where you're trying to impress someone, but in rooms where you're supposed to be the expert, the authority, the person everyone else is looking to for the answer. And in those rooms, the instinct to prove your competence through answers doesn't just fail to help you. It can actively work against you in ways most high achievers never see coming until it's too late. There's a particular kind of failure that only happens to smart people, and almost nobody warns you about it because on the surface, it looks like success. Picture a financial advisor. We'll call him the type, the expert, because, again, you know him. 15 years in the business, certified, credentialed, genuinely knowledgeable in a way that took real work to earn. When a client sits down across from him with a question about retirement timing, or how to structure a 401k rollover, or whether now's the time to refinance, he doesn't hesitate. He has the answer. He's had the answer for years. He can walk someone through diversification strategy, safe withdrawal rates, tax loss harvesting, all of it, fluently, without notes. For a long time, That fluency was the whole product. Clients came in with a problem, he gave them a confident, correct answer, and they left satisfied. It's a good business model right up until it isn't, and the moment it stops working is almost never announced. It just quietly erodes. He starts noticing that prospective clients, people referred to him by existing clients, people who should be easy closes, are taking longer to sign. Some are ghosting after the first meeting entirely. He can't figure out why. He's not getting worse at his job. If anything, he's sharper than ever, faster with answers, more comprehensive in his explanations. So what changed? What changed is something almost invisible unless you know exactly where to look for it. In every one of those meetings, he's spending the first 15 minutes doing what he's always done, establishing credibility by demonstrating knowledge, explaining, answering questions the client hasn't even fully asked yet because he already knows where they're going. And here's the thing nobody tells him. To the client, sitting across the desk with real anxiety about their real retirement, that fluency doesn't read as reassuring anymore. It reads as a sales pitch. It reads as someone who has a script and is running it, regardless of who's sitting in the chair. There's a specific, uncomfortable truth buried in that. The more competent you are, the easier it becomes to mistake explaining what I know for understanding what they need. And those are not the same thing, even though they feel identical from the inside. When you already have 15 years of answers loaded and ready, the temptation to reach for them, fast, confidently, before the other person has even finished articulating their actual fear, is enormous. It feels helpful. It often is helpful in a narrow technical sense, but it can also completely bypass the thing the client actually walked in needing, which usually has almost nothing to do with the technical mechanics of a 401k rollover, and everything to do with something they haven't said out loud yet. Fear of running out of money. Fear of having wasted their best working years. Fear of asking a stupid question and being talked down to. Compare that to a colleague of his, younger, less experienced, less encyclopedic in her technical knowledge, the kind of advisor the expert privately considers less skilled than himself. Her opening move in almost every first meeting is different. Before she explains anything, she asks, "What's actually keeping you up at night about this?" Not, "What are your retirement goals?" which is the version of that question everyone's heard 100 times and has a rehearsed answer for. The specific, sharper version, "What's keeping you up at night?" catches people off guard in a productive way. It gives them permission to say the real thing instead of the professional-sounding thing. Sometimes what comes out is nothing to do with money at all. Sometimes it's, "I watched my father run out of savings at 81, and I am terrified of that happening to me." That single sentence tells her more about how to structure an entire financial plan than 2 hours of technical explanation ever could. Because now she knows the plan isn't just about returns, it's about eliminating a very specific, very personal fear. She closes more of those first meetings than he does. Not because she knows more, she knows considerably less in the raw technical sense. She closes more because her clients leave the first meeting feeling like someone finally understood the actual shape of their worry, instead of feeling like they'd sat through a well-produced seminar. Here's the gut-punch version of this, worth sitting with for a second. Expertise, without the discipline to ask before you answer, doesn't just fail to help you. It actively works against you because it makes the temptation to skip the question and go straight to the answer almost irresistible. The more you know, the more dangerous your own competence becomes to your ability to actually connect with the person in front of you. This is the trap the closer fell into back in that promotion committee meeting. It's the trap the expert is falling into right now, in real time, without knowing it, losing clients he can't explain, losing. And it's a trap that gets harder to escape the longer you've been rewarded for having fast, confident answers. Because every year of being right on command reinforces the exact instinct that's now quietly working against you. So if raw competence isn't the answer, If knowing more, having a better technical grasp, a stronger resume, a sharper pitch, doesn't reliably win the room, then what does? The uncomfortable answer is starting to come into focus, but there's a piece still missing, and it has to do with something almost nobody in that boardroom, that interview, that financial advisor's office actually remembers correctly about the moments that changed how they felt about a person. Here's something worth testing on yourself right now before I tell you the answer. Think back to the single most impressive person you've ever sat across from in a professional setting. A boss, a mentor, an investor, someone who left you thinking days later. That person is operating on a different level. Now try to remember exactly what they said. Not the general impression, the actual words. Most people can't do it. What they remember instead is a feeling, a sense of being read correctly, of having something in them recognized that they hadn't fully articulated themselves. And here's the misconception almost everyone carries into that memory without realizing it. They assume that feeling came from something the impressive person told them, some piece of wisdom, some sharp, decisive answer that cut through confusion. That's the story people tell themselves about what leadership sounds like. Decisive, answer first, no hesitation. It's mostly wrong, and this is the pivot point of everything we've talked about so far, because up to now, this has been a story about individual moments, an interview, a negotiation, a client meeting. But the misconception runs deeper than any single scenario. It's baked into how an entire culture, American corporate culture specifically, with its cult of the confident decision-maker, the guy who just makes the call, trains people to think leadership sounds and looks a certain way, fast, certain, answer-shaped. Go back to boardrooms for a second, because this is where the misconception does the most damage, quietly over years. Picture an executive team debating whether to green-light a product launch. There's real disagreement in the room. Half the table thinks the market's ready, half thinks it's premature. The CEO, under pressure to look decisive in front of the board, does what CEOs are trained to do, makes the call, states a clear position, ends the debate with confidence. Everyone nods. The meeting adjourns, feeling resolved. 18 months later, when people are asked to reconstruct what happened in that meeting during a post-mortem after the launch underperforms, something strange happens to their memories. Almost nobody remembers the CEO's confident closing statement accurately. What they remember, distorted and amplified in hindsight, is a single question someone else asked mid-meeting, and that got waved off too quickly. Are we solving a problem customers actually have, or one we assumed they have? Nobody had a good answer to that question in the room. It got acknowledged and moved past, because the meeting had momentum and a decision to make. But it's the thing everyone remembers, because it's the thing that turned out to matter. This is the misconception laid bare. We think decisiveness is what gets remembered and credited. It's not. What gets remembered, and more importantly, what gets someone credited later as having seen it coming, as having been the smart one in the room, is almost always the sharp question that got asked and not fully answered, not the confident close. The unresolved tension that turned out to be the real issue all along is what changes everything we've said up to this point, and it's worth pausing on directly because it reframes the entire argument. This isn't really a video about how to sound smarter in a meeting. It's about something with much higher stakes, memory and credit. Who gets remembered as having understood the situation and who gets remembered as having just been busy are allocated retroactively, based almost entirely on who asked the question that turned out to matter, not on who gave the answer that turned out to be wrong. Think about what that means practically. Every time you rush to close a debate with a confident answer, instead of naming the uncomfortable question nobody wants to sit with, you're not just risking being wrong. You're giving away the credit for having understood the situation to whoever does ask that question later, even if they ask it quietly, even if it gets waved off in the moment, even if you were the one who made the call that day. Ask yourself this. In your own career, who gets remembered as the sharpest person on your team? Run the memory back honestly. Is it the person who always had a fast answer ready? Or is it the person who every so often asked the one question that made everyone in the room go quiet for a second? The one that turned out, months later, to be exactly the thing that should have been asked. For most people, honestly answering that question is uncomfortable, because it means recognizing that the confidence they've spent years building, the fast answer, the decisive close, the just make the call instinct that got them promoted in the first place, might be optimizing for the wrong kind of memory. It might be winning them short-term approval in the room, while quietly losing them the long-term credit of having been the one who really understood what was happening. That CEO, incidentally, is still remembered internally as decisive. That's not nothing. Decisiveness has its own value, and nobody's arguing you should never make a call. But he's not remembered as prescient. He's not the one people quietly go to now, 18 months later, when a new product decision needs a gut check. That reputation, the harder, rarer, more valuable one, belongs to whoever asked the question that got waved off. And that person didn't do anything dramatic. They didn't fight for the floor. They didn't insist on being heard. They just asked the sharper question at the right moment and let it sit there, even when nobody was ready to answer it. That's the shift we need to go deeper on next, because there's a real difference between asking a sharp question once in one meeting and building the kind of reputation that follows you across years, across rooms, across an entire career. And that difference comes down to something most people never think to develop on purpose. That reputation, the one that follows you across years instead of just across a single meeting, doesn't get built by accident, and it doesn't get built overnight. It gets built the same way compound interest gets built. Quietly, invisibly, through repetition. Most people never notice happening until the results are undeniable. Let's talk about money for a second, because this is where the abstract idea of the question habit turns into something you can actually measure. In raises, in promotions, in deals closed, in the specific dollar amounts that show up in an American career over a decade or two. Consider salary negotiation, something almost every working adult in this country dreads and mishandles. The standard advice is well worn. Know your market value, come with numbers, make your case confidently. Most people walk into that conversation and do exactly that. They answer the implicit question, why should we pay you more, with a rehearsed case. Years of experience, quantified achievements, competing offers if they have them. It's not bad advice, it's just incomplete. And it puts you in a defensive posture from the first sentence because you're the one being evaluated, the one who has to prove something. Now picture a different approach, one used by a mid-career software engineer at a growing tech company outside Austin. Instead of opening her negotiation with her case, she opens with a question. What does the budget actually look like for this role beyond base salary? Is there room in equity, or is that fixed by band? That single question does something most people don't anticipate. It reframes the entire conversation from "convince me you deserve more" to "help me understand the mechanics of what's negotiable here," a subtle but massive shift in who's doing the evaluating. She's no longer a supplicant making a case. She's a peer gathering information to make a good decision, which is a fundamentally different posture, and managers respond to that posture differently, often without being able to articulate why. It gets more specific from there. She follows up with, what would need to be true for this to be a direct-to-track conversation instead of a lateral one? Now, her manager isn't just deciding whether to give her a 5% bump. He's being asked to articulate out loud what the actual path to more money and more authority looks like. And once he's said it out loud in specific terms, it becomes much harder to quietly ignore later. She didn't demand a promotion. She asked a question that made the promotion path concrete, on the record, coming from his own mouth instead of her ask. This is the hidden ladder nobody explains clearly in career advice books, and it's worth naming directly. The person who asks the sharpest, most specific question about how a system works, a compensation structure, a promotion cycle, a deal's actual constraints, ends up with more leverage inside that system than the person who simply performs harder within it. Performance matters. Don't misread this. But performance without someone understanding it, without someone able to see and credit it accurately, is invisible. And the fastest way to make your performance visible to the people who control your advancement is to ask the questions that force them to articulate specifically what they're actually looking for and rewarding. Here's a blunt truth most people avoid saying out loud. The person doing the asking in any negotiation is very often quietly in control of it, even when they hold less formal power in the room. Every question forces a response, and every response reveals information the asker didn't have before. In a salary negotiation, in a vendor contract, in a real estate deal on a first home purchase, in a discussion with a lender about mortgage terms, the party asking sharp, specific questions is the party mapping the terrain, while the other party is stuck reacting to the map as it gets drawn. Think about a first-time home buyer sitting across from a lender, being quoted a rate. Most people, especially first-time buyers, already anxious about the biggest purchase of their lives, just accept the number, maybe push back weakly on the interest rate itself. A sharper buyer asks something like, "What would this rate look like if I brought down my debt-to-income ratio by paying off this one card before closing?" That question doesn't just get a different answer. It reveals, in real time, exactly which levers actually move the number. Information most lenders won't volunteer unprompted, not out of dishonesty, just because nobody asked. Ask yourself this. In your own financial life, your own career, how many conversations have you walked into ready to answer, ready to perform, ready to make your case, without a single question prepared that might reveal the actual mechanics of the decision being made about you? That's the gap. That's the ladder most people never climb, not because they lack ambition or competence, but because nobody ever taught them that the question is often worth more than the answer in exactly the moments that matter most financially. The closer from Section 2 eventually learned this. The financial advisor from Section 4 is still learning it, client by client, meeting by meeting, the hard way. But there's a deeper layer underneath even this. Something about why this specific habit of leading with questions instead of answers doesn't just win individual negotiations, but actually reshapes how people perceive your competence at a level below conscious thought. And that mechanism is stranger and more powerful than most people ever stop to examine. There was a man, a product manager at a mid-sized software company in the Bay Area, though this could just as easily be Denver or Raleigh, or anywhere with a conference room and a whiteboard, who built an entire 9-year career on pitching ideas. That was his identity. He was the ideas guy. Every sprint planning meeting, every roadmap review, every all hands, he showed up with something new. A feature concept, a growth hack, a restructuring of the onboarding flow he was sure would move the retention needle. He was smart, genuinely creative, and for years it worked well enough. He got a seat at the table, got listened to, got a reputation as someone who thought big. But something started happening that he couldn't quite name. His ideas kept getting considered and then quietly shelved, not rejected outright. That would have been easier to metabolize. Just absorbed into a pile of things the team would circle back to, which everyone in every office in America knows is corporate for never. Meanwhile, a colleague of his, quieter, less prolific, someone who maybe pitched one new idea a quarter compared to his one a week, kept getting his initiatives greenlit, funded, staffed. He couldn't figure out why, until one meeting made it uncomfortably clear. He pitched a new referral program, laid out the mechanics, the incentive structure, projected impact, the whole polished performance he'd given probably 30 times over the years. His colleague, when it was his turn, didn't pitch anything. He asked a question instead. What's the actual reason our current referral rate is stuck where it is? Do we know, or are we guessing? Nobody in the room actually knew. There'd been assumptions floating around for months, but nobody had the real answer. And in that gap, that admission of not knowing, sitting there exposed in front of the whole team, his colleague had already planted something the ideas guy's polished pitch never could. A reason for the company to actually invest in finding out before committing resources to a solution built on a guess. 2 weeks later, his colleague was staffed to lead a small research effort into referral behavior. The ideas guy's referral program pitch, built on assumptions nobody had verified, quietly died in the backlog, same as the 29 before it. Here's the moment that changed everything for him, and it's worth sitting with because it's uncomfortable in a specific way. He realized, with real discomfort, that every idea he'd ever pitched had been an answer to a question nobody in the room had actually asked yet. He'd been solving problems he'd decided existed based on his own read of the situation and asking the room to trust that read. His colleague wasn't smarter than him. He wasn't more creative. He'd just stopped answering questions nobody asked and started asking the question that made the room realize it didn't actually have the information it needed to act. So he tried something that felt at first like professional suicide. He stopped pitching ideas entirely for an entire quarter, every time the instinct hit, and it hit constantly, because pitching ideas was his whole professional identity. The thing that had gotten him this far, he redirected it into a question instead. Instead of, we should build a referral incentive program, he asked, what do we actually know about why people don't refer right now? Instead of, we should redesign onboarding, he asked, where exactly are people dropping off, and do we know if it's confusion or disinterest? Something strange happened almost immediately. People started treating him differently in meetings, not as the guy with the next flashy idea, easy to admire and easy to ignore, but as someone whose questions kept exposing gaps in what the team actually knew. His questions started getting assigned as action items. His name started showing up as the person looped in on decisions before they were finalized, not after. Within that single quarter, without pitching a single new idea, he'd become more central to the team's actual decision-making than he'd been in the previous 2 years combined. Here's the gut punch worth sitting with directly. An idea is a claim. A claim asks other people to trust your judgment, your read of a situation they may understand differently than you do, your assumptions about what matters. It's inherently a little presumptuous, even when it's right. Maybe especially when it's right, because being right and unasked can read as arrogant instead of impressive. A sharp question, on the other hand, doesn't ask anyone to trust anything. It just exposes a gap. And gaps, once exposed in front of a group, create a kind of gravitational pull. Everyone in that room now feels the pull to fill it, and whoever asked the question that created that pull ends up positioned at the center of whatever gets built to fill it. This isn't a call to stop having ideas. That would be its own kind of imbalance, its own trap. It's something more specific and more useful. Before you pitch the solution, ask the question that would need answering for anyone to know if your solution is actually the right one. Most people skip that step entirely because asking it feels like slowing yourself down, like ceding the floor, like admitting you don't already have it all figured out. That admission, the willingness to expose a gap instead of rushing to fill it with your own answer, turns out to be far closer to the actual source of influence than confidence ever was. And that idea, the one we've been circling since the very first section of this video, is about to get a lot sharper, because there's a specific reason questions carry this kind of weight, a reason that has almost nothing to do with information. and almost everything to do with something most people have never once considered about the psychology of being asked something. Here's the reason, and it has almost nothing to do with information. When someone asks you a real question, not a filler question, but a precise, well-aimed one, something happens in you that doesn't happen when someone gives you an answer, even a brilliant one. You start working. Your brain doesn't passively receive a question the way it receives a statement. It reaches for something. It starts constructing in real time in front of the person who asked. And here's the part that matters. Whatever gets constructed in that moment feels to the person constructing it like it came from them. That's the mechanism. That's the actual engine underneath everything this video has walked through so far. The interview candidate, the negotiation, the product manager who stopped pitching. A good question doesn't transfer power to the asker by taking something away from the person being asked. It transfers power by making the other person do the work of arriving somewhere, and people trust, defend, and remember conclusions. They arrive at themselves far more than conclusions handed to them, no matter how correct or well argued those handed down conclusions are. This is why answers, even great ones, tend to generate resistance, quiet, often unconscious resistance, while questions tend to generate ownership. Tell someone what to think, and some part of them, even if they nod along, is checking your reasoning against their own, looking for the crack, protecting their autonomy. Ask them the right question and let them think their way to the same conclusion, and there's no argument to resist, because there's no claim being made. There's just them arriving somewhere, believing, correctly in a sense, that they got there on their own. Think about a parent trying to talk a teenager out of a bad decision, dropping a class, quitting a team, whatever the specific version is in a given household. Tell a 17-year-old what to do, however correct the advice, and you can watch the resistance form in real time, almost like a reflex independent of the content. Ask instead, what do you think happens 6 months from now if you quit, and something different happens? There's a pause. There's actual thought, not defense. Whatever answer comes back, even if it's not the one you wanted, it's now theirs. It's now something they have to reconcile with their own choices, not something they have to defend against your judgment. This is not manipulation, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because the line matters. Manipulation uses questions to trap someone into a predetermined answer, engineering the conversation toward a conclusion the asker already decided on before the question was asked, using the appearance of open inquiry as camouflage for control. What we're describing here is close to the opposite. It only works, genuinely and sustainably, when the question is asked in real curiosity, when the asker actually doesn't know what's going to come back and is prepared to be surprised by it, prepared to have their own assumptions revised by the answer. The moment a question becomes a trap instead of a genuine opening, people can feel it. It stops working, and worse, it starts corroding trust in a way that's hard to repair. Go back to the executive boardroom from section 5 for a second, because there's a version of this worth naming precisely. The question that got waved off, are we solving a problem customers actually have, or one we assumed they have? Worked in hindsight, not because it was clever. It worked because it was genuinely unresolved. Nobody in that room, including the person who asked it, knew the answer with certainty. That uncertainty is exactly what gave it weight. A rhetorical question, one where everyone already knows the gotcha answer the asker is fishing for, doesn't do this work. It just reads as a lecture wearing a question mark, and people can tell the difference instantly, even if they can't always articulate why one lands and the other doesn't. Here's a one-line truth worth holding on to. The power of a question is directly proportional to how genuinely uncertain the asker is about the answer. That's counterintuitive, Because it seems like it should be the opposite, that the sharpest, most powerful questions would come from someone who already knows exactly where they're steering the conversation. Some questions do work that way, and they have their place. But the ones that build the kind of long-term reputation this video has been describing, the ones that get you remembered as the person who really understood it, that get you looped into the decision before it's made, that make a hiring manager feel like they're finally being heard. Those come from actual not knowing, from a mind genuinely willing to be moved by whatever comes back. This is why the question habit can't be faked as a technique, a script, a set of power questions, memorized and deployed like a sales tactic. The moment it's performative, the moment you're asking a question you already know the answer to, just to look thoughtful, the entire mechanism collapses. The other person's brain doesn't do the same construction work. It senses correctly that this is theater, and it responds to theater the way it responds to any other form of being managed, with quiet, low-grade resistance. So the real habit isn't a set of clever things to say. It's a posture, a genuine, sustained willingness to not know, to stay curious about what's actually happening in front of you instead of reaching immediately for what you already believe. And that posture, once it becomes real instead of performed, leads directly to the single most useful, most specific application of everything we've covered, a particular kind of question, more precise than anything discussed so far, that does more work in a single sentence than almost anything else you could say in any room you walk into. Here it is. The one question, more than any other, that changes the physics of a room the moment it's asked. What would have to be true for you to be wrong about this? Not aimed at someone else, although it can be carefully in the right relationship. Aimed first and most powerfully at yourself, out loud, in front of other people. Say it to a room that's converging too fast on a decision. Say it to a client who's dead certain about a strategy that sounds shaky. Say it, most importantly, in the middle of your own certainty. Right when you feel most confident, you've already got the answer. Think about why this specific question does more work than almost anything else you could say. Every other question we've walked through in this video, the interview candidate's question about past failures, the negotiator's question about budget mechanics, the product manager's question about unverified assumptions. Those questions expose gaps in someone else's knowledge. This one is different in kind. It exposes a gap in certainty itself. It doesn't ask, "What don't you know?" It asks, "How sure should you actually be about what you think you know?" And that is a question almost nobody in any room is prepared for, because almost nobody walks around auditing their own confidence in real time. Picture a founder pitching investors, a scene that plays out constantly in cities like Austin and San Francisco, and increasingly in places like Miami and Nashville. Most founders in that room are optimizing for one thing: certainty. Total conviction in the vision, no cracks showing, because cracks read as weakness to investors trained to smell weakness. And most of the time, that performance works fine, or at least doesn't actively hurt. But the founders who raise the biggest rounds from the sharpest investors, the ones who get remembered, get referred to other funds, get the follow-on checks 2 years later, are very often the ones who, at some point in that pitch, say something like, "Here's what would have to be true for our unit economics to actually work at scale, and here's what we don't know yet about whether it will be." That sentence should, in theory, spook an investor. It's an admission of risk, and yet again and again it does the opposite. It signals something rarer and more valuable than confidence. It signals that this founder has already done the hardest intellectual work there is, stress testing their own belief instead of just defending it. Here's the counterintuitive core of this entire video, the thing everything else has been building toward. We think certainty is what gets rewarded. In interviews, in negotiations, in pitches, in boardrooms. It gets rewarded in the short term, in the room, in the moment. But trust, the deeper, slower currency that actually determines who gets remembered as reliable, who gets the second meeting, who gets the referral, who gets promoted past people with better resumes. Trust is built almost entirely by the willingness to name your own uncertainty before someone else finds it for you. Think about what would have to be true for me to be wrong actually does mechanically to a listener. It doesn't weaken your position. It reveals that you've already stress-tested it, that you're not asking them to trust a claim. You're showing them you've already interrogated the claim yourself, more rigorously than they're about to. It's disarming in the most literal sense. It removes the need for the other person to play devil's advocate, because you've already done that job, visibly in front of them. Go back to the closer one more time. The manager from Section 2, the one who lost the director role, to the quieter woman with the sharper questions. 18 months after that loss, in a leadership retreat, he was asked, point blank, by a mentor he trusted, why he thought he'd been passed over. His old instinct would have been to defend, to explain, to answer with certainty about his own qualifications. Instead, because something in him had actually started to shift by then, he said, here's what would have to be true for that decision to have been wrong. They'd have to have picked someone who couldn't actually build trust across departments the way I could. And then he sat with it. And what he realized, out loud, in front of someone he respected, was that he genuinely wasn't sure that was true. He wasn't sure he'd built that trust. He'd assumed he had, because he was good at his job, and being good at your job had always felt to him like the same thing as being trusted. That single moment of self-directed uncertainty did more for his career over the following 2 years than any pitch, any confident answer, any polished performance ever had. Because from that point on, he started asking that question of himself before every major decision, every disagreement, every moment of conviction. And it made him measurably harder to blindside, harder to catch flat-footed, harder to out-argue, because he'd usually already found the hole in his own thinking before anyone else got the chance to. This is the thing successful people do that almost nobody else does, consistently on purpose. They interrogate their own certainty before the room does it for them. Not because they lack confidence, because they understand, at a level most people never reach, that confidence without that interrogation is fragile. A performance that collapses the first time someone smarter or more prepared pokes at it. Confidence built on top of genuine self-questioning is a different thing entirely. It doesn't collapse under pressure because it's already been pressure tested by the person who has the most reason in the world to want it to hold up, themselves. That's the habit fully assembled now from every angle this video has walked through. Ask before you answer. Ask questions precise enough to expose real gaps, not filler questions that just perform curiosity. And most powerfully of all, ask the question of your own certainty before anyone else gets the chance to. That's not a communication trick. That's a different relationship with your own mind, and it's available to you starting in the very next room you walk into. Go back for a moment to that conference table on the 32nd floor. The man who talked for 11 minutes straight is still in that room, in a version of this story that repeats itself every day, in every city, in every industry, across this entire country. He's not a villain in this story. He's not even wrong exactly about most of what he said. He's just playing a game whose rules changed a long time ago without anyone sending out a memo. A game where the reward used to go to whoever had the fastest, most complete answer, and now, increasingly, quietly, goes to whoever asks the question nobody else in the room thought to ask. The woman 2 seats down from him isn't smarter than him. That's worth saying plainly, because this video was never an argument about raw intelligence. She's not more knowledgeable, not more credentialed, not working harder. She's just operating from a different relationship with silence, one where a pause isn't a threat to be filled, but a space where the real information lives, waiting for someone patient enough to let it surface. That's the habit this entire video has been circling from every possible angle. Not a script, not a set of clever lines to memorize and deploy at the right moment. Because the moment a question becomes performance, it stops doing any of the work we've spent the last hour unpacking. It's a posture, a willingness to sit inside, not knowing a beat longer than feels comfortable, long enough for something real to surface. In a client's fear about running out of money, in a boardroom's unexamined assumption, in your own certainty about a decision that's never actually been stress-tested. Here's the reframe, the one thing worth carrying out of this video and into the next room you walk into. You have spent your whole life being taught that your value gets proven by what you know. It doesn't. It gets proven by what you're willing to find out, in front of other people, without flinching, without rushing to fill the silence, with something that sounds smart instead of something that's actually true. The next room you walk into, a meeting, an interview, a negotiation, a hard conversation with someone you love, is going to hand you that same old itch. The pull to answer first, to prove yourself fast, to fill the quiet before it says something uncomfortable about you. You don't have to obey it anymore. You know now what's actually sitting on the other side of that silence, waiting for whoever's patient enough to ask. If this changed how you think about the next conversation in front of you, stay a while longer. There's another video waiting that goes even deeper into exactly this.